Badenoch, you are a lecturer in media and cultural studies at the University of Utrecht.
That's right.
Could you say a few words about your research?
Yes, I've done a lot of different forms of research, but generally, I guess deep in my heart of hearts, I'm a radio historian. And I'm currently working on a new project called Transnational Radio Encounters, and my focus of research is on international radio services. Those are services from a specific country to the globe. Mm-hmm. And what I'm interested in is, first of all, the way they communicate with each other and the way they project what a nation is in a global sphere over the course of a long period of time where the configurations of global power have changed a lot. So the shifts from very much a colonial enterprise to a Cold War enterprise to now trying to figure out what they're doing at all in the world. And especially issues such as development, in which Europe very much has constructed itself as helping the rest of the world. Very much the international radio services have been key in that effort and in communicating that effort. And I'm very curious as to what that actually communicates about Europe. So that's my current project, and it's just getting started. So I can't give you any results yet. But,
okay. And you have a research network.
That's true. That's a
could you tell us?
the Women's Radio in Europe network got started partially coming out of research that I had done on my PhD. And the reason we study women's radio entirely is that we call the network Sounding Out the Boundaries, and studying women in radio is a great way to actually understand how radio itself has been defined over the years. And because you start with two supposedly universal categories, women and radio, and when you bring them together you start to realize how unstable both of them actually are. And that happens at the level of the technology itself. One of the ways that radio was sort of defined as a technological space was sort of against women. Women were told that their voices wouldn't carry through microphones properly, and that was a way to keep them off the air. And listeners actually complained that the high frequencies of women's voices would not work. However, the trouble or the interesting thing about radio as a medium is it brought public life into the private sphere, which was normally the sphere of women. So suddenly it needed to adopt forms of address, ways of being that were actually more domestic and more associated with women. So that also created a very interesting gendered category. And very interestingly, what tended to happen is that all over Europe, programs were developed specifically for women, and those were places where women could get employment at radio stations. And they developed pioneering styles such as domestic forms of address. So what we associate now with good radio, which is being very personable, having this kind of personable interview, like we're doing now, is something that was pioneered in women's programming a lot. And so really women became radio pioneers, and in a way regendered both public and private space in a very interesting way. And I'm very interested, and we as a network are interested in exploring these processes together. And the reason we want to do it in transnational comparison is exactly, again, to try to explore these universal categories. Was radio in Germany the same as radio in England? What were the differences? But also, I've discovered in the course of my research that many of the women working at the radio stations in various countries knew each other. They were friends, and they got together and met regularly to talk about what this meant, what proper presentation was. And especially many of them had international experience. They produced programs about lives of women in other countries. And the other is the other point of the network is so much of this scholarship is happening not in English. And I don't think we're communicating ourselves properly. And so this is to bring all of these perspectives from various countries and experiences from various countries together and see what we can discover also about the transnational links between women's programming. So that's the goal of the network. We're having our first workshop in November, our first full workshop in November.
Great. And you were a member of the scientific committee of our symposium, Gender, Women and ICT in Europe. What are the main issues of this conference?
Well, it will come as no surprise that the main issues are very similar. The way both in which ICTs become defined around certain gender categories, excluding women. We saw earlier the way in which telegraph operators, in a talk yesterday, on the one hand they were considered ideal women because they had smaller hands to work the keys, but they were considered not smart enough to handle the technology. So built into whole ideas of users of technology and what the technology is are these gendered notions. And I think that's one thing, that's one aspect that especially as historians of technology, coming from out the Acts 1 of the NABEX, is always important. How do these objects get defined anyway? And the other main thing that I think it really derives around is the many forms of agency that women have been able to discover or lose through communication technologies. Being able to communicate via the internet from their homes. And we actually have a talk later on about girls blogging. And areas such as women's programming, where women actually do get into radio and innovate, but also what the limitations are. And one of the things that we're discovering, also moving over into the questions of work and professionalization, is that as soon as any technical profession gets a female categorization, suddenly it gets lower paid, lower status, and one of the things that this symposium is bringing out is that this is a very, very consistent pattern that's continuing. And it's becoming a lot more relevant now. There are huge efforts to get women involved in ICT, or not ICT, what we call the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and medicine. And I'm curious to see what will come out of this, partially because one of the things that happens with ICT, especially when it gets involved with women, is it gets de-technified. Suddenly when women are doing it, it's just about chatting, it's about blogging, it's about... The technology becomes invisible, and so making the technology revisible in this process, this is an argument that we're having now still about how to revalue ICTs with regard to gender and the work of ICT, and also who's getting paid for this. I think it's very important.
Well, thank you very much for this.
Thank you. I'm very much enjoying the conference.